Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Honorata Mazepus. She is Associate Professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Amsterdam. And today we're talking about topics like democracy, the election winner-loser gap, citizen support for democratic checks and balances, civil society, political legitimacy, and some other related topics. So Dr. Mazepus, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start here with democracy. So from the perspective of political science, what is democracy exactly? And how do you go about classifying particular political systems as democratic or non-democratic?
We start with a really, really big question that could take probably an entire interview in itself.
Go ahead.
So let's open this Pandora box. So of course there is an incredibly huge amount of scholarship trying to classify, categorize political regimes and to find out what makes a democracy. And I think the most basic distinction that we can make in these definitions of democracy is whether we stick to some kind of minimalist definition, which would be it's the rule by the people, and then usually we end up with some sort of a criterion about electoral procedures, right? So you have to have elections so that a regime is called a democracy. And then there are the more extended, broader definitions of democracy that also add additional criteria, which would be criteria such as checks and balances. So, for example, the freedom of the media, the role of the citizens in opposition, pluralism. So all these extra elements would then lead to an extended version of extended definition of democracy. And by many scholars, that would already be called a liberal democracy. So adding this extra criteria would mean that we are ending up with liberal democracy. Now, the question is, can you have just purely electoral democracy without any of these additional criteria? And I think this is where we are now also looking at the political world, struggling a little bit, because the question is it just the rule of majority that we are ending up with when we just stick to this rule of, oh yeah, the winners of the elections have the right to rule, and then the majority is entitled to basically propose and execute policies, right? So without any additional constraints, can this be called a democracy? But purely demos kratos, it would be the rule by the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is very interesting because I mean, I guess that we could say, and you mentioned that briefly there, that there's not just one single kind of democracy or possible democratic regime, and there's also different levels of democracy, right? Because there are many different factors that political scientists and other scholars and even politicians, international organizations look into to classify, for example, how much democracy there really is in particular countries. And I guess that another important thing that you mentioned there is that we usually tend to associate democracy with the rule of the majority. But I guess that nowadays, at least, we also care a lot about the rights of minorities, of minoritarian groups, also their rights and interests also being respected, right? And that also counts as, I guess, democratic or not.
Or liberal. So that's exactly the discussion that we are having, right? So where are these boundaries, and can we have one without the other? And of course, just total limitation of democracy to elections is, we can bring it to the absurdity even, because you can think about having elections in, let's say, old authoritarian communist systems where they were meaningless because you just had one party and that party could not lose. So just having elections obviously is not enough to establish a democratic rule, right? You would not call the Soviet Union a democratic regime just because they organized elections. So here we come with the criteria that are also coming from the the classic literature like Dawes' criteria of pluralism and contestation. So you have to have at least some actors that are competing in elections, some political parties that are fighting for power, and it has to be possible to contest one another, right? So it cannot be that just the Communist Party always wins and nobody can criticize it. So already within this electoral definition, there are extra criteria that are being added to make it a democracy. And then there is, of course, this classical dilemma of the tyranny of the majority, right? So what you mentioned, who is the majority, or who is actually the people who are supposed to rule?
Yeah.
And is it all the citizens of the country, or is it just the majority that at a particular moment prevails in elections, right? And what do we do then about the rights of the minorities? And this usually comes under the definition of liberal democracy. So how do we treat those who don't necessarily win the elections? Yeah. And it becomes increasingly complicated in more diverse societies of nowadays, right? When you have multiple groups coming together. So if you think about how we used to live as humans in our small scale communities, the diversity was very limited, right? So basically the will of the majority would represent almost everybody. And it was also much easier to check whether the powerful actually violate the rights of the minority, who would be maybe, I don't know, 10 people out of 50, right? And nowadays, this becomes very complicated and intricate in the diverse societies. But also you can see that because of that, we have this gradation of democraticness of different political systems, and that some systems perform maybe better in terms of including those minorities in the governing, and some perform a bit worse. So to give you an example, I live now in the Netherlands. I come from Poland, so I can at least compare from my own experience, but also as political science, how these systems perform. In the Netherlands, you never have a majority government. The pluralism is so high in terms of the political game and political actors that are competing, that it is impossible to rule just with one party. And this is not the case in, for example, Poland, where you can have a majority government, right? Which means that in the Netherlands, you always automatically include actors that are actually minority actors in the governing process. So even small parties that don't get a lot of votes have always a chance to end up in a governing coalition just because the system allows it, right? And there is, first of all, there is no threshold for getting into the parliament. And second of all, you have so many parties that actually collect votes that you cannot rule with just one party. So you always have to build a consensus. This can have also disadvantages, of course, in terms of policy making. But when you think about potential extreme policies that can come with the majority rule, they are kind of eliminated. And these are usually the dangers of having one political party, majoritarian party, come to power, because they can exclude then the minorities from the decisions and even harm them, right? So because of that, well, different political systems will perform differently, although they might be in principle still called all democratic.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think this is a very important point to drive home, because many times when people think about democracies, we focus mostly, I guess, on everyone being able to vote. If there's universal suffrage there, right? But I mean, democracy is much more than just being able to vote in elections. It's also many other kinds of political participation that you are allowed to have, right? Like, for example, having the right to protest, participate in manifestations, if you disagree with certain political decisions, or if you want to demand certain political rights, for example, having a right to hunger strike or something like that, having the right when it comes to labor rights to create labor unions. And so there's a bunch of ways of participating in politics that must be granted for them to be democratic, right?
Yes, and I think this is also something that distinguishes, maybe this is, I don't know if it's still an appropriate term, but more mature democracies from, let's say, democracies in making. That you have many more permitted, but also stimulated ways to actually participate in this democratic socio-economic or socio-political sphere, right? Yeah. So there is very little that is forbidden apart from, you know, like the usual regulations, regulatory state that we have. And there is a lot of scope for expressing either your interests or your preferences or disappointments. As you say, associational life is a part of it, right? But also the institutions that are not state institutions, such as the media, play a very important role there, right? And if you compare then democratic regimes with non-democratic regimes, you see that the media space is much more pluralistic in mature democracies than in constrained environments of either new democracies or authoritarian regimes. At the moment when an authoritarian regime falls, suddenly you get this chaos of information, right? That was suppressed for a long time because only particular information was allowed to, fill in, let's say, the informational space. And once that constraint is over, then you see new information that was probably there but suppressed coming out, and then you have this moment of kind of new ways of thinking being allowed and being voiced also in the public space. And this also then structures in the end the media environment in this democratizing situation. Sometimes it leads to this step towards either developed or consolidated democracies, as it's called in the literature. Sometimes it is again suppressed by the actors that start to overtake and dominate that information space. And then that comes like with, for example, in the case of Russia, which I studied for a while, it comes with all kinds of restrictions on the information space, but also the activities. So what you were talking about, right? Who is allowed to create an association? Which interests are going to be present in the public space? Who is going to be called a foreign agent, for example, rather than domestic NGO, non-governmental organization, right? So this is what distinguishes really this democratic space, public space, or socio-political, socio-economic space from authoritarian space.
And by the way, another very important aspect here that I think you've alluded to there briefly has to do with, just generally speaking, freedom of expression, right? Freedom of the press, the freedom of expression for individual citizens, and also the ability to manifest political opinions, criticize the government without suffering any political, economic, labor consequences. I mean, without getting fired, for example, without being put into jail or legally persecuted in some way, right?
Exactly. Yes, it's about the freedom of expression, freedom to, or the right to protest, the right to associate, and these associations do not necessarily have to exactly align with, let's say, the political color of the government, right? So this is all that, it also seems, let's say, the most intuitive aspect of democracy. So voting is one thing, but the other thing is this freedom to criticize and contest those who are in government by expressing your opposition, but also expressing your interests that might be overlooked by that government, right? Or just even your existence, if we are talking about some minority groups and their livelihoods.
But when it comes to the so-called rule of the majority, I mean, as we mentioned before, but I'm going to stress it again now, it might be in particular contexts at least a little bit problematic because, of course, in democracy, in human society more generally, we have people with different kinds of interests, and of course they want to push for their own interests as individuals or groups politically. That's just how things work. But sometimes if a particular majority is interested in oppressing minority groups, that can also happen. And also if a particular majority of people are interested in that specifically, they might be able to politically overturn democracy if they prefer, for example, an autocratic system and vote for a political party that serves those particular kinds of interests. Right?
Yes, definitely. And this is now considered a problem not only of the new democracies or those countries that for some reason they're still called new democracies, but they democratized already in the 1990s, right? So at some point, maybe they're not so new anymore. But it is all encompassed under the term of democratic backsliding. So basically countries that have reached mature, consolidated democracy, and that after a party that has maybe not so democratic tendencies comes to power and has the majority in the government and in the parliament, takes steps towards actually decreasing all these checks and balances that we have in the political system to control their power, right, as citizens. And this is exactly the problem that we are struggling with now. And we also see that more and more we have a scientific consensus that it is not just a problem of new democracies, that this can happen anywhere, right? That even in the oldest democracies that we have, which are still not that old, by the way, our democratic history is not so long, but even in these oldest democracies like the US, it can happen that you have within a party or within particular sections of a party trends towards decreasing democracy. And if that party wins, then it seems like we are in trouble, right? So of course, I'm alluding now also to the win of Donald Trump, and then particular powers within the Republican Party that they cared a little bit less about the independence of courts. Another aspect that is happening, and this is not just limited to Trump's government, but in the US, for example, it's a very common thing to interfere with the electoral boundaries of, which is called gerrymandering, right? Of the precincts within which voting is happening so that we can skew the elections in a particular way. So this kind of trends can happen, and it can happen exactly when the majority is given to particular political options that maybe do not care about democracy so much. And that was also the case in Poland. When the Law and Justice came to power, they started interfering in different ways with the checks and balances. So the judicial system, but also then the media space suddenly was being limited. So the public broadcaster has been pretty much taken over by the government and became something like a propaganda tool for the governing party, which, in democracies, this is not what public TV should be, at least normatively, right? And also the limitations of rights of women were in the end imposed by that party. So, step by step, starting with the judicial reform, but also then moving to the information space, and then in the end to this citizens' rights. I wouldn't call it minority rights because women are a majority, but let's say more vulnerable people's rights, limitations as basically a move towards grab of power, so executive power of the party that is in charge. So that's exactly what you're saying, right? That the majority rule does not necessarily always mean that we increase democraticness of our political systems.
By the way, there's something very interesting that you mentioned there. That is basically that democracy, at least as we understand it today, is a very recent political phenomenon historically, because sometimes we talk about, for example, democracy in ancient Greece, in Athens specifically. But if we go into the details, I mean, it's very different from the kinds of particularly liberal democracies that we are used to today, because even back then, and this is just one aspect of it, there were others, but apart from them having slavery. It also, the people who were considered citizens and could participate politically. I mean, it was basically almost just an elite of people, right? And so just those two aspects, and there were others, of course, makes it very different from the kind of democracy that we tend to think about today, right?
Yeah, so it's yes and no in terms of being a recent phenomenon. So in terms of the institutional shape of democracy that we have, yes, it's a new thing, right? So if we think about this large scale, remote actually institutions that are operating, this is something newer. Constitutions are something that is new, for example. So they start in Europe, in the US in the 18th century, right?
Yeah.
The ideas, of course, are not so new, as you say. Already the the idea about how to take decisions, about some kind of consensus building. This has been there, and you mentioned the ancient Greece and the city-state systems. But if you think about it, actually our communities, from our evolutionary perspective, they were more democratic than not, right? Not in the institutional sense, but in terms of how they were deciding about how they were making decisions about the most important issues that they were facing back then.
Basically, how they would run their societies, even if they were smaller scale.
Yes. So this is still a very preliminary research, but I also base it on the research of others that has been done with the anthropological records. What we can see is that the anti-domination intuition in the small-scale communities was very strong, right? So, of course, it varied a little bit because you had communities that faced different challenges.
Right.
But if you think about the most common trends, they were very vigilant of being dominated by the leaders, and the decisions were taken communally. Of course, it was much easier because you had smaller communities, so basically everybody knew each other. Everybody knew what the intentions of the other persons are, and they could easily control.
Let me just ask you, just to clarify, you're referring there to traditional societies, like, for example, hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, perhaps pastoralists?
So I looked, in this particular study, we look only at hunter-gatherer societies. And these are anthropological records, so they're based on ethnographies. So these are not, our societies as thousands and thousands of years ago throughout our evolution, but they're the best proxies, I guess, we have in terms of how these small-scale face-to-face communities operated. So this is what I'm talking about. And in this project, we look at how the communities contested their leaders and their decisions, and when they wanted to grant more power to them, right? So exactly this idea of when we delegate power and when we want to constrain it, to find out what kind of basic intuitions we have, and maybe then think about, okay, which of these checks and balances that we have in terms of large institutions nowadays are more intuitive, and which ones maybe people care the most about. Because in the end, there is not so much backlash against democratic backsliding as you would expect if you would think, okay, we have this strong anti-domination intuition, but then, when this particular authoritarian party comes to power, why don't we act as citizens? Why don't we have this drive to actually do something about it and prevent them from constraining our freedom?
No, it's very good that you clarified that, because what I mentioned, I was not thinking or considering at all smaller scale societies. I mean, I've already had tons of anthropologists on the show, but in this particular case, I was not thinking about them specifically. But I was perhaps thinking more about larger scale societies with perhaps hundreds of thousands, millions of people participating in them. And I was also perhaps considering the fact that democracy, or at least recent democracies, I mean, it was a process to get there. It was not just, for example, that the US got their independence, or there was, for example, the French Revolution, and they instituted a republic there, and then suddenly overnight anyone could vote, anyone could participate politically. It was a process, I mean, not only for the vast majority of citizens, including in the early stages the vast majority of men, but also women and particular minority races and other people like that.
Right? Of course, it was a struggle for suffrage rights, right? And maybe we could use the 18th century mark or 18th, 19th century mark as this moment when suffrage rights expansion was something that was happening. Although, you know, even some European countries, such as Switzerland, were very, very late in the 20th century to introduce suffrage rights for women. But the 18th century is when that starts. And that's also the process that included a lot of deliberation among the elites about what happens, and this comes from my research with a historian, actually. So what happens when we give the suffrage rights to these uneducated masses, right? So that's where the discussion about the populism and the populist mob or the manipulation of the masses already starts. So this is the 18th century when we are developing our democratic checks and balances. So some say that this trias politica and democratic checks and balances are introduced exactly to control the power of the mob or the potential of manipulation of the masses by the populists. So by some, this is also seen as a very elitist move, right? To actually constrain the influence of the people. On the other hand, of course, you also have to consider how do we want our decisions to be made, right? So you can decide majority is always right, but you can also decide, well, there are situations where merit, so actually knowing things about the issue at stake, is very important. And the further we get with our technological development, the more complex the issues that the states are dealing with we have. And therefore, perhaps the role of merit and knowledge and maybe even technocracy increased over time as well, right? So we had this, or we could talk about some sinusoids. Sometimes it is, it is going up, how much technocracy we have, and sometimes we go back to this majority rule and the will of the people and this kind of rhetoric in our political systems.
And by the way, we're going to get more into democratic checks and balances, but I guess that when people think about them, they usually think about checks and balances for politicians, just for politicians to not abuse the power they're granted by the people, so to speak. But there's also, I guess, some checks and balances that the political system itself tries to keep, like, for example, there might be certain instances where if we add just a general vote, perhaps a majority of people would vote against the rights of particular minority groups, but that's just not allowed politically, right?
Well, yes, hopefully. So, we have.
Yeah, I was just saying that sometimes, at least, those checks and balances are also there against even the will or the possible will of a majority.
Yes, so that's exactly why we have them. We have courts, right? Also that control whether the democratic civic rights of citizens are being complied with by the governments and also other actors in society. And yeah, another thing about this, how do elites actually act out upon the rules? I think that's an important issue, and this is perhaps you're familiar with this book by Levitsky and Way, and they actually look at the American political system, and their argument is that what went wrong in the recent electoral waves or after the recent elections in the US, when Trump won the elections, was that the elites actually failed in preventing the power grab by that one particular leader who had non-democratic intentions.
Yeah.
So they point to not only the kind of formal rules or institutional constraints, but they point out that the elites themselves are also responsible for what they do and whom they encourage and what they allow. And this is maybe more in the territory of informal rules, and then thinking about, okay, given we care about the rights of citizens, or assuming we care about the rights of citizens, we should not allow such a politician to represent our party, for example, right? That's the first step. If we know they are non-democratic and we are Democrats, which Republicans would claim they are, obviously, right?
Yeah.
I think actually in not even in the authoritarian regimes, the leaders would claim that they're authoritarian. They would always claim that they're democratic. So that's another.
They
another
are for the interests of the people, at least.
Exactly. So they would use that side of the definition of democracy, of course, to justify their rule. But going back to the elites, it's that we have the citizens, and they are, in my view, they are crucial as well in what happens in the political realm of their own country. But we have the elites who can also take choices that lead either to the development of democracy or sustaining of democracy or deterioration of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's something that we hear frequently. I don't think that there's any dictator historically or presently out there that ever said that, oh no, I'm only here for my own interests. They also claim that they are they're fighting for the interests of the people, the will of the people, or something like that, or the nation. I mean, if they would just say, "Oh no, I'm just here to take advantage of my own citizens," I guess that they would probably not last long in their position.
No, and these are exactly the legitimation strategies, right? So why do I have the right to rule? It's, as an authoritarian leader, I would never say it's because I want to dominate you all and I want to grab as much power and as much resources as I can. No, this is not going to work. So to be recognized as a legitimate leader, you have to convince people that you are actually doing something that is enhancing their well-being. And the will of the people is one of the arguments, again, very misguided, because what does that mean, right? There is no one will of the people, ever. Even if you have a homogeneous society, you will have competing interests. This is just the way things work. And Ben Ansel has an excellent broad audience book that came out recently, Why Politics Fail, and he discusses extensively this idea of the will of the people and the misconception we have about that, and that actually you can never have the will of the people. It's just not possible. It's how you handle the conflicts in society that actually shows how mature you are as a democratic society, right?
Mm-hmm. And by the way, let me get into a very specific topic that perhaps we've already ended up touching slightly on in our conversation here. But in your work, for example, you explore the election winner-loser gap. So what is that exactly?
The winner-loser gap in terms of responses to the electoral result implies that there are differences in how the winners and losers of elections think or perceive the political system and the political reality more broadly, but also in the end, how they perceive their own place in that system, right? So that's, I think that's in short how you can specify it. And the research there started by just looking at whether the winners and losers of elections are to the same extent satisfied with democracy. And the gap means that, no, there is a difference between them, right? They are not the same satisfied with democracy. They express lower satisfaction if they lose elections, and they express higher satisfaction when they win elections.
So there's a connection to subjective well-being here, right?
So that's one of the endeavors, let's say, of this research that we started with Dimitar Toshkov, who is at the University of Leiden. Because I focused first, so maybe let's start with the first part about democracy and then move to the well-being.
Sure.
So I started with thinking about the specific elements of democracy. So what we discussed, right? Elections, but also all these checks and balances. So freedom of the media, opposition rights, the right to protest. And my idea, coming also from political psychology, was that our coalitional psychology should steer us to pay more attention or be more vigilant about the violations of checks and balances when we lose elections, right? So we already had some indication that maybe the winners of elections like elections more when they win, right? Obviously. But what happens then with these other elements of democracy? And that was the first part of this study that we conducted, both with observational data, with the European Social Survey, but also with an experiment in Ukraine, where we tried to find out if you win or lose elections, does it affect how much you care about the freedom of speech, the rights of opposition, and the media criticism against the government? Yeah. And indeed, we found consistently that there is an effect, that when you lose, you care more about constraining the power, which makes sense, right? These effects are not necessarily huge, but they are there. And this also implies that our ideas about democracy or how much we value it is not something stable. This is something conditional, depending on the environment in which we are operating. And that was the starting point. But then we thought, okay, so winning and losing elections, it's a little bit like sports, like playing a game, but with higher stakes. And we have evidence from all kinds of physiological studies, psychosomatic evaluations, that people respond physically to winning and losing, at least in sports. But we also have evidence from all kinds of coalitional winning and losing among animals that show that there should be some effect on also well-being, or at least in terms of stress hormones being released, right? So how our body responds to winning and losing. And we thought, well, let's see whether at least in terms of attitudinal responses, we find that effect. So we did not study the physiology of winning and losing, but we studied the attitudes of citizens. And indeed, we found out that when you are losing elections, you feel less optimistic. You feel, at least you evaluate your health as worse than when you win elections. And this was done also with observational data from the European Social Survey that was conducted twice. At least we looked at two data sets from 2012 and 2018. And this also allowed us to have the shifts between the losers and winners, right? So different parties were in charge in 2012, then in 2018. So who was the winner and who was the loser also changed there. So we accounted for that in that study design. Again, these effects are not huge, but it shows that there is really something there that we need to pay attention to in terms of thinking about our values, democratic values, right? And their stability. And then I don't really like the word biases, but the biases that we have depending on which side of the coalition we are. I don't think they are really biases, because it's justified to be more worried when you lose, right? Well, your rights will be constrained at the moment that the opponent wins, or will suddenly you have to watch out what you say when the opponent wins. Is your job then at stake, right? If you disagree with your boss and he supports a particular party or is connected to a particular party. So I wouldn't call it a bias, but then how would you call it? It's not really a bias if it's totally justified, but basically the shift. So the responsiveness of these values that some thought are maybe very stable, right, in the literature.
Yeah, it's not a bias if it's totally justified. I mean, that's a very interesting point, because I was actually going to ask you. So at a certain point there, you mentioned that if you are a loser, sometimes you want more constraints on the political system, the political power, and perhaps that would sometimes imply constraints on democracy or democratic processes. But But particularly if you have particular interests in mind, like, for example, protecting the rights of certain groups of people that after the democratic process are under threat, for example, perhaps having that impulse to really want some constraints on the established political power, even if it's under a democratic regime, might not be that bad, right? When you want to protect perhaps the rights of certain people, and even sometimes not necessarily just minorities, but even a majority of people that might suddenly see their rights taken away, or perhaps being put under economic and social pressure, depending on the measures or the policies that the particular political party in power takes. Right.
Yeah, so the losers want to contest the power more. So they are actually supporting the checks and balances more. And, normatively, well, it depends, right? If you think that we should go for the liberal democracy, then normatively, this is the right thing to do, to actually contest the powerful if they're trying to harm particular groups in society. And of course, the problem is then that if you get the majority government that wants to eliminate or limit these constraints, then you have a clash, right? So what you see is maybe we should talk about some kind of gradual development of the political regimes then, that when one path of influencing the government or constraining the government is closed, another one is being opened. Or when one right is being limited, then you go for still the things that are available in the public space, right?
Yeah.
So thinking about what happened in Poland with at least in the first term of the Law and Justice Party, when they started constraining the rights of women, women went out massively to protest. The protest right was available. It was not constrained yet, right? So they could use that civic right to express their disagreement with the government. That was actually something that worked, unfortunately only short term, because in the second term of rule, the Law and Justice went further with constraining the women's rights. But you can see that the women still had the option. They took their right and they went out to protest. Not only women, by the way, men also supported their actions massively. And then you have situations like in Russia where coming out to protest at some point is no longer possible, right? Because you put yourself in really huge danger, and then it's basically your assessment of your risk and gains that you can get from actually taking that action, right? So the longer we allow the government to take the rights away and to constrain the checks and balances, the less likely it is that we will be able to pay the cost of coming out and protesting and pay the cost of actually opposing that government, to the extent that at some point it's just no longer even considered, right, an option, only by those who are, I don't know, either the bravest or have the least to lose.
So we've already talked a little bit about that here, but what are some of the main factors that influence citizen support for democratic checks and balances? And I read in your work, for example, about effects of partisanship and economic performance. So could you tell us about that?
Yes, of course. So this is also, again, a research that I do in the stream of other research that has been done before, right? So I build on some of the works that inspired it. And one of the papers that I was inspired by was Matthew Singer's paper who looks at the developments in Latin American countries. And he observes that when the perceived performance of economy by the governments is being evaluated as high, so the economy is doing well in the eyes of citizens, then they are more likely to grant more power to these governments. So basically, that means that they allow the government to execute reforms that then increase the power of that government. And it could be, in terms of presidential powers expansion or limiting to what extent you have to care about the parliament, right? That's one of the things that you can imagine. So that was the thing that that inspired then my research, which I also took further with experimental designs. Mm-hmm. And here you see that the economy is the factor that he emphasized, and also losing winning. So whether you support the government or you do not support the government. So coalitional thinking is what I derived from that. And they are both very important. And I indeed find evidence, both observational and experimental, that when the economy is performing well, then citizens are a bit less vigilant. So they are more okay with, for example, constraining the independence of courts, right? They are more willing to give up this right to constrain the government. Mm-hmm. And similarly, the losing-winning effect, so this is what we just discussed, the coalitional effect is that if you lose the elections, then you are paying more attention to the government and what they do, and you want to keep this right to constrain them. So you are finding those more important elements of democracy. Mm-hmm. And maybe one thing to follow up on that is that this is also linked to, at least one of my studies shows some evidence of that, that when we look at the opponent introducing a particular reform, we see more malicious intentions of that reform when it's about the checks and balances, when it's about democracy. When we have a person with whom we align, we have the party rule that we like, or the party that we feel strongly attached to is in charge, then we are thinking that their intentions are benign. And to give you an example, when you are facing these proposals of political reforms or changes that the politicians want to introduce, they can give you all kinds of reasons. And as we discussed before, nobody will say that they have an undemocratic reason behind it, right? They will always say this is to do something good, something positive. When there is a proposal for reform of protest rights, for example, the common argument that you can find by politicians is to increase the safety of citizens. Who doesn't like safety, right? Then the opponents will say, well, but this is then limiting our possibility or making it more difficult for us to come out to the street and protest against you. So now as a citizen, you are standing there and like, yeah, well, safety, good reason. Having the right to protest, good reason. Who is proposing it? My opponent. So probably they are actually wanting to limit me, right? So you see the malicious intention behind it. If you won the elections and this is the party that you like, who is proposing it? Like, that's a fair argument. Safety is very important. So you see the benign intention behind that proposal, or at least you're more likely to see that. Now, there are also differences between the supporters of different political parties. So some just care less, some care more about democracy. But in general, this effect holds for everybody, right? So if you are winning or losing, it determines what kind of intentions you see behind the proposals of the government.
Mm-hmm. So there's also two concepts here that I would like to ask you about that probably play a very important role in democracy and other political regimes, by the way. Mm. But in the context of political science, what is civil society? What does it mean exactly?
I think that's another concept that we could discuss for an hour or so at least. And there is really a lot of scholarship that tries to define it and tries to also distill the effects of civil society on democracy. But in general, civil society encompasses all kinds of organizational, associational life that is distinct from politics and business.
Okay.
Right? So this would be all kinds of organizations or associations that bring together citizens for particular goals, but they are not attempting to get power, and they are not just pushing, lobbying for particular business interests. And it can be really anything that goes under that label. So that's why it's a very problematic concept sometimes to think about, because it could be you know, a circle of village, I don't know, knitting fans, right? Or it could be actually an organization, non-governmental organization that monitors the transparency of decision making, that monitors the corruption levels. That could also be an NGO, right? Or a civil society, non-governmental organization. And because of that, this organizations or this civil society space can have either stronger or less strong effects on democracy, right? So there are some that argue that actually even this kind of network of citizens that is not necessarily aimed at monitoring the politicians, like, you know, people who have specific hobbies or do sports together, that even this is already something that is creating a very valuable addition to democracy because it creates interpersonal trust. So that would be Putnam's argument, right? Bowling alone. When we don't go anymore with our friends, the kind of fabric of our society disintegrates, and that has a negative effect also then on the institutional trust, for example. There are others who argue that actually what matters is these organizations that are strictly targeting the monitoring of political institutions. And this could be, as I said, you know, anti-corruption monitoring or human rights monitoring organizations. To some extent, maybe you could think of some that analyze, so all kinds of think tanks that analyze the merits of policies that are also checking the politicians, right? If you have some complex scientific issue, and then there is maybe a proposal that violates the most recent findings or our established knowledge, scientific knowledge, they could contest these decisions, for example, right? So this would also fall under civil society.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned at a certain point there, for example, just the simple fact that some people play sports together and how that leads to interpersonal trust, and it can have certain political effects, because I was also thinking that I mean, on the one hand, there are, for example, people that say or claim that everything is political, which perhaps is a little bit exaggerated, but on the other hand, it points to a very important fact, I guess, that is probably many of the things that we do in our lives, how we conduct ourselves, how we interact with other people in society, even though they might not have any direct political expression, might translate politically or into political behaviors. And for example, I guess that you mentioned interpersonal trust and sports there. I guess that on the other extreme, on the other end of the spectrum, in modern industrialized and post-industrial societies, a very common phenomenon is for people to manifest loneliness, and we having, particularly in bigger cities, a more atomized society, which perhaps sometimes we don't link that directly to political behaviors necessarily, but that might have political effects, even if it's just sometimes the fact that people might get politically disengaged. Right.
Yes, for sure. You're completely right. And there is really a lot that we still don't know about the effect of the move of our lives online on the communities, and then how that affects in the end you know, our perception of what creates this Kratos, right? So who are these people with whom we are actually creating a political system? And yeah, it starts with these communities, and you can think it's you know, a little bit outrageous. How come a sports club can actually have any effect on larger democracy, some remote institutional system? But it is about interacting with people, and it also depends probably on the type of club you are participating in, how diverse that club is, how large it is, what kind of network you are creating. But imagine a running club. This is what I am familiar with. I would, in my normal, you know, online day with students who are also a very particular population, I would not encounter this diversity of people as I encounter in my running club, right? Even the fact what kind of jobs they do is sometimes to me surprising. Oh, this exists, and these people, have these problems. These people, are engaged in this kind of activities. So this creates already some kind of idea about who we are as society, and it creates bonds. Mm-hmm. There is also the problem that you might have these very homogeneous groups that have very specific goals, and they do not interact with others. And here we come to, or maybe even are antagonistic towards others, right? And let's say the online space has advantages and disadvantages in creating groups. They can introduce more pluralism, but they can also create the idea that these more extreme voices or more excluding voices are more prevalent. So you find easier these people with extreme ideas just because there is a lot of information. There is a lot of people that you would never encounter in your real life there, and you can bond with them as well, right? Mm-hmm. So this creates perhaps another another impulse into this civil society space that we are talking about. So I think we still don't know exactly how the online spaces will, in the end, affect both our interactions in these communities, the offline communities, but also then how they will steer, democratic engagement or maybe, negative engagement. And to give you an example from, again, the research that I did in the post-Soviet space and also in Russia, we have such a term as uncivil society. Again, I am not sure whether this is a fair term, fair concept, but this usually refers to those organizations that are very exclusive, that engage citizens on the basis of particular criteria like ethnicity or values, for example, conservative Orthodox Church values and vision of the world. So, for example, disengagement with the West as being the evil influence versus, engagement with some kind of Slavic Orthodox traditional base, right? So based on very exclusive identity, that is present in these post-Soviet countries. And this is referred to sometimes as uncivil society. Yeah. There are different reasons for that. One is the type of values that they promote. And these values can be attractive to people, right? Conservative values, religious values. This is not something that, again, is immediately normatively wrong. They are not progressive values. So then, again, if you take a normative stand, we should aim at improvement rather than, living the way we are, living in the state that we are in. Mm-hmm. Then it becomes a debate. But purely normatively, there doesn't have to be a judgment there. So these organizations attract those kind of people. But then the problem, and I think that's why they are often called uncivil, is that they are very often also stimulated by particular state actors. And then we get into this territory of, can they still be called a civil society? Because they are influenced and very often funded and also supported by the state actors. And here in this post-Soviet space, this is the influence of the Russian state that promotes this kind of organizations that then actually also promote their values and their ideas about the world in the post-Soviet space, countries such as Belarus, Ukraine, or Moldova, which I researched. And then we get to the point, okay, so are the civil society organizations, can we always assume that these organizations within society will promote democracy? Not necessarily, right? Because if the status quo is not democracy and these organizations are conservative, they want to preserve the status quo, it means we are not gonna move towards more democratic, open, inclusive society. Mm-hmm.
No, for me, this is a very interesting topic. And I mentioned earlier, for example, bigger cities and a more atomized society, because I guess that in this particular case, what I was referring to was not just the fact of people in particular situations perhaps not wanting to engage with society, with politics anymore because of their particular situation, but also how the particular political, economic, and social context leads people to those kinds of situations. Like, for example, one thing that I'm very interested in is the phenomenon of hikikomori in Japan. There is the so-called shut-ins that is something that went up or became more of a phenomenon after the economic crisis in the late 80s, where people were used to just go complete their university degrees and then get accepted into one of the leading companies in Japan and be there for life. I mean, completely stable jobs, no job insecurity, good economic prospects, the prospect of building a family and all of that. And then suddenly they lost that, and now there's 1 million plus people in Japan that just withdraw from society. They live at home in their room, and they just say that they don't want to engage with society anymore. They don't want to engage with people anymore. They are perhaps on the internet, but that's the most they get from, even if we can call them, social interaction. And also sometimes I watch videos that some people make with homeless people in the US, and some of them also mention more or less the same. They say, look, I'm done with society, I'm done with politics, I don't care anymore. So I mean, it's a very sad situation, but it's also, I guess, a symptom and a manifestation many times of how being economically, politically, and socially disenfranchised, where that leads people or can lead people.
Right? Yes, for sure. And I think economic safety is also, in a way, a precondition for active participation in politics, right? So yes, there are situations where those who are disadvantaged actually stand up and protest. Usually it is led actually by those who have more capacity to do so. That also, involves, I don't know, maybe the suffrage rights for women, right? When you had these women that were better off, that started mobilizing the interest. But also, even when you think about the Marxist revolutions, right? These were the elites that drove actually the action for the rights of the workers. So the workers were too busy working, right? Or when you think about people who are in very grave economic situation, they don't have time to simply come out to the street and engage with this political processes. They also, of course, can be completely disenchanted and think it doesn't matter. First there was Gorbachev, then there was Yeltsin, then there was Putin. Nothing changes in my life. Why would I ever actually participate in politics? It doesn't affect me directly. This is also very dangerous, of course, because then you might end up with a regime that uses violence in your name, but you do not identify with that, right? So this is also what many Russians are probably facing at the moment, because a lot of the society was completely disattached from politics. They thought this is none of their business. Politics is for politicians. Real life is for normal citizens. But at some point, you then end up in a situation when your government is taking decisions in your name that are horrible, right? But in the end, it is about this ability to participate in politics, and you can only do it when you have some sort of well-being. So it is not for nothing that we have this ongoing debate: does economic development come first or democracy come first, right? What should we achieve first to actually better the lives of more people? And then your example with the US and the homeless people. This also shows that, the social democracies that actually provide the safety nets might encourage more political participation just purely because they give more people the capacity to participate in politics. And I think if we kind of trace the development also within Europe of different countries, you can see that, right? That there is more engagement, even if we just look purely at how many people vote, so the turnout numbers for elections, that this comes with also the functioning welfare state in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess that this is also probably one of the reasons why when there are revolutions, it's usually middle-class people leading them, because they have at least enough stability to be able to devote resources into that kind of level of political participation.
Exactly, right? Yeah, they can afford it simply, yeah.
Yeah, and so we were talking about civil society here, but on the other hand, we also have external actors. So what are external actors? And by the way, what is the interplay here between civil society and external actors?
So there can be different types of external actors, and external meaning, this is not an actor that necessarily is vested within some domestic polity sphere, right? And for the actor that I looked the most at was the European Union and Russia as different, entities. So one is an organization of states, the other one is a state, that actually try to promote their interests in other countries, right? So they enact particular strategies or policies outside of the boundaries of this organization of their own state. And one of the examples was exactly this civil society actors that promote particular conservative Russian Orthodox Russian speakers' values in what Russia calls, and this is also not approved by the countries themselves, of course, but the Russia calls it their near abroad. Kind of diminishing the agency and sovereignty of the states in their neighborhood. And then what is the neighborhood, the eastern neighborhood of the European Union? So the European Union calls it the Eastern Partnership countries, right? So this would be two actors that have some sort of state formal organization. They are external, but there can also be external actors or perceived as external that we all know also from other literature on globalization, such as international non-governmental organizations, right? So it could be, I don't know, Amnesty International, MSF, so Doctors Without Borders, right? These are also external actors that can come to another country and provide services, promote some values, protect some rights. It could even be, of course, environmental organizations such as World Wildlife Fund, for example, right? So these are external actors.
And so I would like to get now into the topic of legitimacy, but just before that, we've been focusing a lot on democracies here. But what are hybrid regimes?
Well, hybrid regimes are regimes that combine elements of democracy and authoritarianism. Again, this is a very kind of shadow sphere of regime classification, right? So it's very difficult to determine when one regime is still a democracy and not yet authoritarian, and then when they are really consolidated authoritarian regime. And regimes such as Russia, somewhere between the end of the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s, were often referred to as hybrid regimes. Also, Venezuela of Hugo Chavez was classified as a hybrid regime. And this is because the regimes still kept elections. They kept, or those who ruled these regimes, they kept elections, they kept organizing them. There was some contestation, although increasingly limited, and there was still some pluralism in the public sphere in terms of the media. So there were constraints on these checks and balances, like the media and the organization of political parties, for example, but it was still much more pluralistic than in what we understand as a classical authoritarian regime or dictatorial regime, where you just have one party or one ruler that dictates everything.
By the way, in the particular case of Venezuela, now with Maduro in power, is it still classified as a hybrid regime? Or...
I think now it's already classified as authoritarian regime.
Okay.
Again, as I said, this is a very difficult situation to know where exactly the tipping point is, something that we still have to determine. But I think the best way to check that is to look at research of VDEM, varieties of democracies, who monitor over time the changes in the regime. So then you can actually determine where the tipping point happened, right?
By the way, I'm not sure if you were going to add something else when I interrupted you to ask you about the regime in Venezuela, or...
No, I think that's all right. Well, what we did also in this one of the research comparative research pieces that we conducted was to compare the legitimation strategies of different leaders who had authoritarian tendencies, such as so in hybrid regimes, Putin and Chavez, but also the leaders, the political party in Seychelles, so completely different regimes. And as we discussed before, they all use democratic arguments, they just use different ones, right? So they use very similar legitimation strategies, they just fill in the content of the strategies with the context of their own country, basically. So whatever fits to actually give them more power, but still present them in a positive light.
Okay, so talking about those legitimation strategies, how is political legitimacy established exactly?
Well, again, a very, very contested idea. And it depends whom you would ask. So I think legal scholars would just say, well, when there are laws and laws are being followed, then we have legitimacy, right? But as you probably already noticed, I am someone who is more interested in how citizens make sense of political reality and how they evaluate it. And I think in that, when we take that perspective, then legitimacy is, we can only talk about perceived legitimacy and legitimacy in a particular context. So we cannot have one definition of legitimacy. What we can say is that legitimacy is to perceive someone as having the right to take decisions for us, right? So authority that can make decisions for us without the violence. So if we add violence to this, then, well, can we call it legitimate, right? If you feel forced, if you say, oh, I disagree with this authority, and the consequence of that is that they put me in jail or they decapitate me, well, then it doesn't seem very legitimate. So it has to be a kind of voluntary transfer of power to an authority. And then there will be factors that are more universal that affect it, but the specificities of how these factors are being filled in, let's say, will be contextual. And the context might mean, some sociocultural norms, or even, who is in the majority, who is in the minority currently in society, whose interests are represented and who's not. But in general, building on my research and the research of that was done before, I would say that legitimacy is established through fairness, and fairness in terms of distribution of resources. So perceived fairness, again, right? That's why it will be contextual. Perceived distribution of resources, perceived fairness of procedures being applied. And here by that we would mean applying the same rules to all citizens, including politicians. And in the end, also, of course, receiving some personal benefits from the political system that we have should be there. Because if you never get anything, why would you contribute anything to that system, right? So if you feel like, well, I'm always losing, I never get anything, I'm always excluded from the policies that are being established, why would I grant legitimacy to these authorities?
And are there different kinds of legitimation strategies?
Yes, for sure. So they will differ probably somewhat between the regimes, right? So authoritarian regimes might use different strategies than democracies, although there is also a lot of overlap. But if you think about authoritarian regimes, strategies, very often they find an enemy, right? So an enemy makes the need for everybody to rally around the flag and support the leaders. And then we might grant more legitimacy to that leader because we feel like they will protect us. And this is also something, by the way, we would find among these hunter-gatherer societies, that when there is a threat, there is more power granted to the leader. The thing is that they very quickly, after the conflict is resolved, or after the battle is over, they very quickly bring the leader down. So he's again kind of leveled, and he's one of them rather than above them, which is not necessarily how it works in current mass societies and mass politics. So that would be one legitimation strategy. Another legitimation strategy would be economic performance. So emphasizing how good the government or the leadership is doing in terms of the economy. It can be job creation and then unemployment limiting. It can be foreign investments that comes into the country. Sorry, I'm a bit lost for words. So attracting foreign investment, that would be something that also Asian countries very often use as their legitimation strategies. It could be also, in the end, fairness of distribution. So as I said, I find that citizens perceive it as something that is very important to grant legitimacy. So when the governments can explain why the resources are being distributed in a particular way, and they can make a good argument that this is a fair distribution and it is beneficial for the society, then that could also be a legitimation strategy. So not only economic growth, but also how the resources are being distributed.
I'm very fond of smaller scale societies, and it's interesting to know that you've looked into some hunter-gatherers, because I really like reading ethnographies and work on smaller scale societies, because unless the leaders are able, and that's already in bigger scale or somewhat bigger scale societies, unless they're able to accumulate enough wealth and resources and people around them to control, people in smaller scale societies usually do not put up with nonsense, with abuse of power, with bullies, nor anyone like that.
No, exactly. That's why underperforming leaders are very easily removed in these situations, and we don't have such a direct mechanism in our politics. It takes usually a while, and sometimes it takes so long that it's very difficult to remove them again, right? So this is the difference between this direct kind of interactions, political interactions, and indirect ones.
So that's about political legitimacy, but then another concept is political capacity. So what is political capacity, and does political legitimacy matter for political capacity?
So political capacity is the ability to actually enforce decisions, right? So if you are governing, you would hope that you can actually do something, right? If you have the power, you can do something with that power, and you can achieve some policy outcomes. So why legitimacy matters often is because if you decide that this is the law in the country now and nobody follows it, this means that this was futile, that actually, your political capacity is non-existent because nobody complies with the decisions you are taking or the laws that you are trying to implement. And a funny example of that, and this is in a functioning democracy, still functioning democracy, is that we have a ban on particular fireworks in the Netherlands. And this is a state policy, so that there is, the state can take such a decision. They have the capacity to do so. It was agreed, it was announced, yet nobody or many people do not comply with that decision. So it means that particular decision, at least, is not being perceived as legitimate, right? So people
by the way, let me just ask you, was that decision made on the grounds of, I don't know, environmental risks or what exactly?
Yeah, so there are, of course, many things that can be said that are wrong with fireworks. But one of the things is, of course, this unnecessary stress to animals that they are experiencing. The other one is the amount of accidents that is happening. So on humans, right? So there is just basically increased capacity of the hospitals needed for that period because people are losing their eyes and are being harmed by the fireworks. And also, and that is a little bit of the culture of the Netherlands and the particularity of society here. This night of the New Year's is the night when a lot of laws of conduct are kind of thrown out of the window, and there is a lot of fights happening, right? So it also requires additional police capacity to actually put down some riots and unnecessary vandalism. And so in the end, there were very many different reasons to do that. And I guess these are good arguments, but you can also have an argument, well, we as the Dutch people, we like to celebrate in this way, and the government has no right to tell us that we cannot do so. So on one hand, you have the government issuing a decision. On the other hand, you have the population saying, well, you can issue it, but we don't recognize it. And this is exactly when then the political capacity is meaningless, right? Because without actually the legitimacy granted to that decision, nothing changes.
And does the way in which governments respond to disasters affect their legitimacy?
I think in the same way as generally legitimacy is being generated. So I know that you're referring now to a very specific paper that I have with Florian van Leeuwen, where we used an experiment in different countries, if I remember correctly, 5 or 6 different countries, in which we manipulated the situation of a flooding and how the government responds to it. And in that particular experiment, the government could either help fairly to everybody who was affected, or they could just help some people only, right? Where it created disparity in the sense that not all those who were in need were given some help. The government in that scenario could also either involve citizens in decision-making, so kind of survey what is needed and get into the discussion with the people that were affected, or just ignore their requests to have this discussion. And then what we also manipulated in that particular scenario was whether people got something personally or not, right? Because not everybody was actually affected. And what you could also manipulate in this scenario is that you either got something or not. And then in the end, what we find is that the strongest effect on perceived legitimacy, so whether you like this government and you want to grant them power, was the distributive justice. So whether the resources were fairly distributed across those who were in need. And in that sense, I think it's, when we confront it with reality and we think about the ecological validity, it does make sense, right? So distributive fairness as the main factor. The procedural fairness also mattered. This is again a very contested effect, because some studies show that procedural fairness, so whether you follow the same procedures in similar situations and apply the same rules to different people, these effects are varying depending on the context. Sometimes it seems like, for example, we like a referendum as a procedure when we know that we win it, right? But that's not really a big commitment. And there are also other studies that show that maybe this procedural fairness is very contextual, and when it matters depends on what situation we are analyzing. But here, this engagement of citizens, so the scenario in which the citizens were having the right to say, well, we need this, and this help is what is required now from the government, that increased also the perceived legitimacy.
So now that we've covered legitimacy, let's get into the hot topic of our conversation today. That is the
After 1 hour
European
30.
the European Union. So
We talked a little bit already about the EU as an external.
yes, but there are some questions here that probably many people are interested in seeing addressed, not least perhaps the Brexiteers and other people like that. So, getting into that, I would like to ask you about another concept that then we can apply to the European Union specifically. What is regulatory governance and how much of it do we have in the European Union?
So I will try to be short and concise now. We have a lot of it because regulatory governance is basically everything that the European Commission is trying to do with their specialized agencies. And there are many of them, right, in different sectors of politics and society. So if you think about the EMA, the European Medicine Agency, this is regulatory governance. If there is a decision or a regulation issued by such an agency, like about vaccines, this is regulatory power of the European Union. If you have issued decisions about the safety of particular products or the safety of particular materials, like what can be in plastic bottles for children, for babies feeding, this is regulatory governance of the EU. So there is really a lot of it. And yeah, I think despite the fact that there is a lot of it, we know very little about it because it's kind of happening in this technocratic space of decision making.
But sort of related to that, are there any legitimacy concerns here when it comes to the European Union? Is there, for example, enough respect for national sovereignty? Because you hear that argument, as I mentioned, from people who supported Brexit, but also sometimes from other political parties in other political countries across the European Union that are not very fond of remaining in the European Union. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think there are two important things. So there is the European Union is, of course, a complex supranational organization, right? So it doesn't only have the European Commission, which is a technocratic body. It also has the European Council that includes the governments of all the countries that are members of the European Union. And the decision making is different. Also, the delegation of power is different. So the problem of the European Commission is that they are not elected, right? These are experts that advise on particular policies or regulations. And that's where we come back to our definition of what is democracy and what is the role of different elements of democracy. You clearly do not delegate power through voting to the European Commission. So if you think that democratic governance can only be achieved through voting and not through competence, which the European Commission's authority is based on, then we have a problem of legitimacy. Now the question is, can we delegate authority or legitimacy only on the basis of voting? Or are we okay that some decisions and some regulations are established by experts? That's basically the kind of dilemma that we are dealing with. And then, what does it mean for the national sovereignty? So the European Commission can take different decisions. If it's a decision, it has to be implemented. But they also issue recommendations. And recommendations can be either taken up or rejected, right? And there is another type of decision making that now skips my mind, but the one that, it's a directive. The one that specifies what is the goal, but doesn't show the path towards achieving that goal, right? So that is in the discretion of the states themselves. So again, it depends really on which decisions we are talking about, how much they might potentially infringe on the sovereignty or national sovereignty. Now, again, we can go back to the treaties and think about, okay, if you join this organization, what does that mean for your sovereignty? And this is all specified in the treaties of the European Union. And in particular policy aspects, such as the ones that have to do with the common market, we agreed that we will have synchronization of rules, right? So that our standards are the same and that our rules are the same for all the members of the European Union. There are other policy domains that are not affected like that because they are not the core policies of the European Union. And here, much more discretion is in the hands of the states, or actually there is no European power over these issues. Very little European power, for example, is over foreign policies of specific countries, right? So you for sure know that even in the times of very pressing security crisis, we are having still a lot of opposition towards creating common European security structures. So we have some of the beginnings of this policy, but for example, for many countries, it is unimaginable to have the European army, right? So a lot of these issues are still really in the hands of the states themselves. And then there is, of course, also the compliance. So, for example, the European Union can say, well, you should not use that particular component in the plastic bottles for babies. And then still multiple countries in the EU can say, well, so this would be something that the European Commission is issuing as advice. Our state or domestic authority that specializes in this says otherwise. So we either do it or we don't do it, right? So the EU can say it's safe, and then France can say, well, we ban it anyway. And this happens very often.
And so just looking beyond the sort of narratives that we many times hear from particularly political parties that want for their countries to leave the European Union, and some of the concerns they express that sometimes, I mean, we have to take it with a big grain of salt because many times they just want to leverage their political power and so on. They're just thinking about their own political interests. But do we have good enough data on to what extent the average European Union citizen considers the European Union itself legitimate or not?
This varies a lot across the different countries. So I think in general, there is no huge legitimacy crisis. So even in countries that are maybe a little bit more skeptical towards the EU, often the citizens are even more skeptical towards their domestic governments. And here, for example, I'm talking about Slovakia, right? So the question is, what is the concerning level of legitimacy, and then what should worry us? So I think the main problem of the relation between the citizens and the EU is that citizens know very little about the EU. So they know, still maybe not a huge amount, but they know a lot about their domestic politics. And the EU politics is so far removed from them that it is very difficult for an average citizen to evaluate how good or bad it is for them. And therefore, these manipulations from the strategic politicians might be even more effective when you talk about the European politics, because there is even less, we have even less tools to check it. So nobody is going to read these regulations that are concerning particular elements of plastic bottles, or which citizen is actually going to look at the reports about the safety of a new vaccine that the EMA is issuing, right? So in Denmark, for example, I don't know if you remember this, but when AstraZeneca was contested because of some potential side effects, the EU, the European Commission, issued a recommendation that it is safe, but already the domestic kind of debate steered the citizens also against AstraZeneca, and it was ultimately banned. Although probably on a large scale, this was the vaccine that saved the most lives because of the stage in which it was approved and introduced, right? So you see that it's very difficult, well, even for experts to know what to do, but then imagine an average citizen, like where do they pick up their information from, and how could they know what's the right thing to do here?
Which is, I mean, politics, of course, is a very complicated issue also because private citizens have their own lives, their work, their private lives, and so on. And so it's very hard and demanding for individuals to keep up to date, even with their own national politics and everything that's happening, and even less so with something that happens at a supranational level like the European Union. And then also probably in schools, people also do not learn enough about the different institutions that operate in the European Union, the powers they're granted, what they are able to do or not. So, I mean, it's understandable, at least to some extent, why people, particularly when they are going through some economic, political, social issues, would feel like supporting parties that promote narratives against the European Union. Right.
Yeah, for sure. So this research that we are doing, and this is with Dovile Rimkute, again from Leiden University, on agencies, right? On the European Commission's agencies. Even for us, just to understand these decisions of even one agency, and then imagine the entire scope of different technocratic decisions that are being made, it's just very, very complicated. So for citizens, it is impossible to get direct information about it. If they are even very interested, it will be difficult to process what is being published. But then again, when we actually do experiments and we manipulate how decisions are being made, and for example, we show the citizens that the agency is taking the decision on the basis of this scientific grounds. And we did it with, for example, an issue that citizens could care about, which is a safety of dried meat. So when you dry meat, what kind of recommendations we have so that we can keep it safe and that you don't get basically food poisoning when you go and eat it in a restaurant. So when we show citizens the expertise, actually they are very responsive to that, and they support this kind of decision making. They would approve a decision that is based on merit, right? Yeah. So then it seems like the legitimacy is not being harmed. But there is this one thing that we are missing in this chain, is actually getting that information to citizens, right? That they know that there is some expert that cares about their well-being, and therefore they conduct proper scientific investigation about, under what conditions shall we store and prepare this meat, so that when we go out to a restaurant or when we do it ourselves, we don't get food poisoning. And that step is missing. So that's, I think, the trickiest thing for the EU to gain legitimacy.
And before we move on to the last topic of our conversation today, how does the EU deal with potential public backlash?
That's, again, a very, very long topic, actually. But maybe not. Maybe they have very limited tools to do so. I think that's the first answer that I could give you. So when we think about, so what would be public backlash? So one thing is, of course, what you referred to in terms of Brexit, that you have politicians that manipulate particular information and then steer citizens against the EU. So that's one thing. What I investigated together, and this is actually a project led by Dimitar Toshkov, is the backlash of citizens towards the EU punishing their own country because of violations that the government is committing, right? And this is the specific case of Poland that we focused on, but you could also imagine other countries that are violating the treaties by basically breaking democratic rules, which happened in not only Poland, of course. We know that this kind of violations happened in Hungary. They are to some limited extent happening in Austria, in Slovakia, so in multiple countries in the EU. However, the EU or the European Commission has not been taking a lot of action against that. Poland was actually the first case where the European Commission and also the European Court of Justice started issuing decisions, but also implementing punishments. So that was something that was unprecedented, that the Polish government was punished with €1 million per day for installing an institution that was basically sort of censoring the judges in the country, right? So it was a kind of a control institution for what kind of decisions judges are making. And this is clearly against the independence of judges, which is an element of the treaties of the European Union. You have to comply with that to be a member. But until these kind of violations happened, the EU did not really have any tools to respond to such developments. And now the question is that you are asking, well, how do citizens then respond to that, right? So if the EU is punishing their own country with here actually very substantial financial punishments by implementing infringement procedure, then what do citizens make of it? Well, again, the problem of the EU is that citizens mostly don't know. So this was one of our main findings, that citizens had no idea that this was the sum that the EU was imposing on the government. There was, of course, later also the discussion of the blocking of particular funds for Poland, but this was the first infringement procedure that had this €1 million per day punishment. And what we found out is that there is very little that you can do to actually convince citizens that this punishment is either right or wrong. So they kind of already predetermined their idea about it on the basis of their political attachment. And so the political identity, whether you are in general pro-European or anti-European, this already accounts for most of the decision-making in terms of do you support such a punishment or not. The only thing that we found in our experiment, and again, this is very preliminary finding and it needs to be replicated and we need to study it in more context, but perhaps there is some truth to it, is that basically manipulating the social norm, so the norm prevalence, increases support for punishing these violations of the rule of law, right? Because that was this court's problem was the violation of the rule of law. And then if citizens were presented with the information, factual information, that most citizens in their society are supporting the rule of law, they think it's important that the judges are independent, etc., etc. If you created this feeling of majority norm support, then that increased your personal support for the punishment that the EU or the European Commission installed on Poland.
And by the way, do you think that there are any, I wouldn't even say easy, but good solutions to deal with this sort of gap that we see between public knowledge about the EU, how its different agencies and institutions work, its political legitimacy and so on, and basically, I guess, support for the EU and its policies and so on?
I wish I knew. I really don't know if there are any solutions and if they are not simple, because we are just also dealing with human interests and human limitations, right?
Sure.
So how do you get to that stage that people are actually interested in politics? Shall we actually make all people interested in politics? Because another thing that we find consistently is that those who are really invested in political game are the most polarized and, are the ones that are responsible for most of the conflict as well, and maybe even deterioration of political systems. So, there are different things that we need to consider when we want to, think about the engagement. In general, we believe that engaged citizens are a good thing. And if we believe that, then there has to be some kind of easy way of translating these abstract policies into citizens' lives. So one of the things I observed when I was doing some research in Belarus, for example, was that where the presence of the EU is completely limited, right? But the EU is still engaging in Belarus. They had at the bus stop screens with information, what can the EU do for you, right? So very directly trying to speak to the citizen and what can they get from the EU. So maybe this is like a hint of what could be done in terms of translating this presence of the EU into citizens' lives. And I think one of the recent findings also, and this is maybe relating to Brexit and this backlash against the EU in terms of Brexit, is that negative campaigning is not always what drives citizens, but we need more positive emotions or positive campaigning in politics. So there are some hints that the Brexiters won because they basically said, we will make the NHS work for you, right? It's sort of like the Belarus, what can the EU do for you? And now it is actually just wasting our resources on the EU. But what we will do is we are going to bring the NHS to you now, and we are going to put it at a higher level. And maybe that worked more than the negative campaigning. Whereas the campaign of the anti-Brexiters was mostly based on fear of Brexit, right? So not what staying in the EU should bring to you, but what leaving the EU will take away, and what is the fear and the chaos, all these complex things that citizens also don't understand. So talking about the common market workings, rather than actually, okay, tangibly, what does it mean for me, and what does it bring to me? So in terms of positive outcomes. So I don't have research on that. This is more from reading of others' work, that these are the things perhaps that could work, but there is really plenty of things that we need to learn first to know whether this is applicable at all.
So let's get into the last topic here today then. I would like to ask you a little bit about international humanitarian interventions, because you've also done a bit of work on that, and it's always a relevant topic, but perhaps even more relevant in the current international political context. So does domestic public support matter when it comes to these kinds of interventions?
I would like to believe yes, when we talk about democracies, right? So in general, democratic governments are more constrained by public opinion than authoritarian governments. So they should listen to some extent also to what the public thinks because of their electoral gains and losses that come with it. So you would think that they pay attention. So it means that not normatively, whether we should intervene or not, that's not something that I'm discussing, but it means that in principle, what citizens think should be relevant to the governments taking decisions, including about an intervention in a foreign country. What we found in our studies is that it's very difficult to actually manipulate the context in which citizens would support an intervention or to increase it, because the general level, when there are atrocities happening, and this is in terms really of humanitarian kind of intervention, right? Not to go and gain resources or drill some oil somewhere. It's really about when the domestic government is persecuting, killing, or threatening with genocide their population. And basically there is no other way to protect them than if someone else comes in. So these are the situations we are talking about. So in general, people already make their mind up, and they are quite supportive of that. So if this is the kind of criteria that we set, this is a humanitarian intervention, this is the goal, to protect the population from being killed, then people are quite supportive. What we found increases the chances of an individual to support such an intervention and how it is being intervened, so whether in a military way or with humanitarian aid, depends on some personal preferences in terms of militarism. So how militaristic are you, right? So if you actually think that the armies could solve problems, or you think that they cannot. So the more militaristic you are, the more likely you would support an armed intervention. If you are less militaristic, then you would support more humanitarian action. Chances of success is something that people consider as well, but it's very difficult to operationalize chance of success, because what do you mean by success, right? And different scholars try to study, for example, the numbers of saved people or prevented casualties, some sort of losses and gains operationalizations. But it is very difficult to tap into the exact effect. So, if we save 100 people, does it matter more than, or do we support it more than when we save 1,000 people? Does it matter what kind of people we are going to save? Are they Democrats or non-Democrats, right? This kind of things have been studied. Small effects. In general, I think we have similar tendencies as in other contexts to feel more supportive of people who are more like us. But the effects are very small. And then the last thing that we found also is, and this is in a newer study with Eamon Eloyo and also Natalia Kubalova, we manipulated the legality in terms of the UN approval of such an intervention. And we found out that when we have three conditions, so in one condition we have illegal intervention, so the UN Security Council doesn't unanimously approve, versus neutral, so we don't have information about the UN approval, and versus then finally the legality, so unanimous approval. The legality actually increases support for such an intervention. The thing is that there is no difference between the neutral condition and illegal condition, which kind of suggests to us that people know or have this kind of intuition that most of these interventions would be blocked and would be illegal in terms of the UN approval, which is also true, right? Because it's always either China or Russia blocking it, or the Western countries blocking an intervention, depending on what intervention we are talking about. So to achieve actually unanimous decision of the UN Security Council is almost impossible nowadays. So the default is actually illegal intervention. But basically signaling, again, we have a consensus about it, increases people's support for such an intervention.
So would you like to, just before we go, would you like to tell us about the sort of work you're doing now? What topics are you going to explore in the near future?
Sure, that's very exciting, because I'm moving forward with this analysis of anthropological records of hunter-gatherers to find out when do they grant power to authorities and when do they constrain it. So this is like the first building block of then taking it further and testing whether the same kind of intuitions are still present in our modern minds. So I would like to further focus on which checks and balances we find the most intuitive. And then I am developing some experimental work to test these effects, of course, depending also on funding, because that's the main limitation always for us as scholars, to have someone fund your ideas. But that's the direction that I want to go into, and I want to focus mostly on this intuitive responses to violation of checks and balances, different checks and balances, but also the intuitive granting of power. So when do you want to grant power to authorities? And I play a little bit with the ideas also that is in the that are in the literature on leadership. To what extent does competence matter? To what extent some other traits play a role, such as warmth? And this trend of studies actually started also with me being involved in a project recently in Ukraine. So one of the things I want to elaborate on is to know when people grant legitimacy or power to leaders and when they constrain it. And the recent example of such a study is a study we conducted with Lasse Laustsen Henrikas Bartusovicius, Florian van Leeuwen, and Mark van Vugt from the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. The study was conducted in Ukraine, so in the context of war, and we wanted to know whether the war changes the preferences for traits we value in leaders. And to our best knowledge, this is the first study where we actually talked to citizens that were experiencing war. So we have conducted this study in the first 2 weeks of the Russian invasion on Ukraine. And what we did is we actually assigned participants to different conditions. One was just the situation now. So we asked them to think about the situation now and whether and what kind of traits they would like to see in a leader if they needed to elect one now, which for them meant in the times of war. And in the other condition, participants were randomly asked to imagine that the peace has returned to their country and that they are about to elect a new leader again. And what kind of traits would they like to see in them? And what we see is that while in the war condition, the preference for dominance is higher, once people think about the peaceful conditions, so return to normal, democratic, peaceful reality, the dominance trait is being less preferred. So it actually goes back to a lower preference for dominance. And still, even in the condition of war, citizens of Ukraine preferred the warmth and competence of the leader much more over the dominance. So although you see this shift in how much dominance we want when we experience war, we still value the other traits more, right? So the competence and the warmth. So this is the findings that we have, and we hope that soon we will share also the results in a publication.
Great. And if people are interested, where can they find you and your work on the internet?
Well, they can find me at the website of the University of Amsterdam. And of course, there is also Google Scholar, so feel free to browse through the publications. I strive to have all my publications available, open access. And if they are not published, then they are in journals, then they are published at the OSF platform. So people can just freely access them and hopefully enjoy.
Great. So Dr. Mazepus, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It was really fun to talk to you, and hopefully I will have you again in the future, somewhere in the future, because I really want to talk to you about the studies or the work you're doing on those hunter-gatherer societies, because it's an ongoing topic on my channel. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. This was great. It was a fun and hopefully also informative chat. And I look forward to connecting again.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sundo, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Mark Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeagy, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanous, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Asteri, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.